Hi, I'm Allison, and this is Learning Literature. If you have requests for a writing topic you'd like help with, just put it in the comments. Today, I'll be talking about everyone's favorite assignment, the 5-paragraph essay. I'm assuming you're familiar with it, probably from your English class, but maybe history or a different humanities course. The advice I'll be giving today focuses on an English example, but you can use these strategies anytime you're writing a 5-paragraph essay. I'll be focusing on giving an example with my thought process along the way and some detail on how to write certain sections. But before we dive in, let me offer some general advice. The first suggestion that I have is to focus on the main content. This can seem really obvious, but actually I think it's usually not taught like this. Many times students are told to start at the beginning, think about their introductory paragraph, and then worry about the hook sentence that pulls the reader in. That's not the right way to do this. You need to focus on your main idea, always thinking about what am I defending? What evidence am I giving to support that? What do I have to say about this topic? Things like your introductory paragraph or a brilliantly written concluding statement are nice to have, but if you don't have good material in the rest of the essay, they're not going to make it a good essay. Think of it like this. If you're a knife maker and someone asks you to make a knife, you focus all of your time on the handle. It's intricately carved, it's sanded incredibly smoothly, it's beautiful handle. The guy comes to pick up his knife and it doesn't cut. You never got around to making it sharp enough to actually do what a knife does. The customer is obviously not pleased with your work. You haven't given him the main thing that he wanted, a knife that cuts. It's like that with your 5-paragraph essay. We're interested in your ideas. What are you arguing, and what reasons are you giving me to show that that's true? It goes the other way as well. If you go to a knife maker and he hands you a wonderfully balanced, incredibly sharp knife with a really basic handle, you're probably pretty happy to buy it. It does what you need. It cuts really well. The same logic holds for your essay. If you have a clear argument presented, all of your evidence is focused on defending a claim, and that claim is well supported, then it's going to be a good essay, even if you don't have an exciting hook and a beautiful conclusion. So when you're brainstorming, when you're writing, focus your time and your energy on the main content. That's your thesis statement and the evidence for it. You can worry about making it beautiful and frilly later. With that in mind, you want to always think of your thesis as a claim that needs defending. That's the work that this 5-paragraph essay is doing. It's defending a claim. You never want your writing to be distracted. Every sentence that you write should have a purpose, and the purpose should always have a clear connection back to your thesis. You're presenting an argument. Arguments need defending. That's the work that you're doing. The thesis is your goal. Everything that you're writing is designed to lead the reader to that goal, persuading him that it's true because of the reasons that you've given and analyzed. The reasons, then, always need analysis. It is your job to explain how the evidence supports your claim. Everything that you provide as evidence, a plot point, a quote, a character description, all of it needs analysis to explain how it works to defend the claim. Remember, everything you're doing is focused on supporting this claim. You never want to lose sight of that, and you always want to make it clear for your reader. A general point about all projects or larger assignments that you're given is to take small steps. Basically, nobody looks at a blank screen and just has a 5-page paper pour out of them. That's fine. You're going to do it in stages. Each stage will hopefully seem small and very manageable, and once you put all of those pieces together, you'll have your finished product. Don't get overwhelmed, break it down into pieces that you can handle, and then put them together to produce the whole work. My last piece of advice holds for everything you'll ever write, and that's to write badly at first. Give yourself permission to write badly. Don't worry about getting the language as perfect, as accurate, as beautiful as you can. That comes later when you have the time to do the revising. But now we're focusing on the ideas. getting them clear and making sure that they're all working together. It's not about perfect writing at the beginning. Let's look at an example. In my mind, the assignment for this was something like analyze a main theme in The Outsiders, or maybe the teacher would specifically prompt, show what The Outsiders says about prejudice. So I'm going to develop a 5-paragraph essay showing what The Outsiders says about prejudice. I'm assuming at this point that you would have read the book and hopefully discussed it, maybe in class, taken some notes, done some highlighting, but you haven't done a deep dive and really analyzed the piece. Because of that, it's important that you think of your thesis as a tentative thesis. It's what you think for now about the book. Until you really do a deep dive, rereading it, analyzing and really thinking about certain quotes and passages, you don't know for sure what the book says on any topic. So you can develop a tentative thesis based on what you think you know about the book, and then you can do a deep dive to see if it's actually supported. Think of it like this. If I said to you, what's the best candy in the world? Reese's Peanut Butter Cups being the correct answer. You might pause for a moment and then say, oh, well, I think that's my answer. Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. Yeah, that's the best one. Am I sure? I mean, I haven't had all of the candies in my city or my state or my country. There's a lot more candy I need to try. Before I'm ready to say it's the best candy, I have to do more research. It's the same with your thesis. Before you commit to your thesis, you need to do a lot of research. That's okay. That's what the writing process is about. So you'll develop a thesis. It's tentative. It's what you think is true of the book right now, but you're open to changing it if your research says that you should. Okay, so what do I think The Outsiders says about prejudice? It's bad? Okay, that will be version 1 of my thesis. The Outsiders says prejudice is bad. Good thing I gave myself permission to write badly at first, because that's not brilliant writing, but at least it's a basic direction. I have a thesis now. The Outsiders is telling me something about prejudice. Don't do it, it's bad. It's a start. How can I do better? Let me think about in what way prejudice is bad. What does the book say is wrong with prejudice? It leads to bad judgments. Lots of people in the book draw wrong conclusions about other people, mostly greasers and socias, and they do that because they have prejudice. Okay, so version 2. The Outsider says prejudice leads to bad judgments. That's telling me in what way it's bad. Is that everything that The Outsider says about prejudice? No, I have to include something about all of the violence that occurs throughout the book. It's obviously a pretty major issue. Okay, so let me include that as also part of the problem with prejudice. That leads me to version 3. The Outsider says prejudice leads to bad judgments and dangerous situations. This seems good. I can probably come up with a lot of evidence for this. I think it's true of the book, and it captures a lot of the main ideas about prejudice. Great. Let's pause on working on our thesis and start brainstorming some evidence. After all, if we can't find evidence to support this, we might need to change the thesis. So it's a good time to pause and make sure that I really have a lot of examples that support this thesis. If you can at this point, as you're brainstorming, you can also think about organizing your evidence. What kind of a structure will your 5-paragraph essay take? When I was thinking about my thesis, I had certain examples already in mind. I think that Ponyboy really shows us that prejudice is wrong because he's not what we expect from a greaser. Maybe I could say the same thing about Johnny. Oh, and Derry, that's probably another good example. Could I give any examples on the other side? Yeah, I think we see Cherry and maybe Bob and Randy, and they all don't act exactly the way that I expect a Soc to. Okay, so tentatively, I think that I'll do my support paragraphs analyzing characters. I'll do one for Ponyboy, one for Johnny, one for Derry, one for Cherry, one for Bob, and one for Randy. All right, I might have a problem with my organization, but let me see what kind of material I have. What sorts of examples can I come up with? And I can always reevaluate my plan for organizing. The first example that I was pretty sure I would use is about Ponyboy. So I just sort of summarized the ways that I think he shows us that prejudice is wrong. He's not a traditional greaser. I said Ponyboy does well in school, likes poetry, and tries to stay out of trouble. 3 ways I think that I would not expect a greaser to act. Johnny also plays a really major role in the story. Obviously, his adventure with Ponyboy and his eventual death are really important plot points. And I think that he also demonstrates a very non-traditional understanding of a greaser. We see that he likes Gone with the Wind, and he's really skilled at analyzing literature. Okay, that could be my second support point. There's also the plot point that Ponyboy and Johnny risk their lives to save kids who are trapped in a fire, an action which ultimately kills Johnny. This isn't so much a character description, but an actual action that characters take, so this plot point might be helpful in showing that they don't act in the way that I expect. I also thought that I could give a description of Derry, which was unexpected for a greaser. He works hard at his job, and he cares deeply for his brothers. In fact, we're told in the big fight at the end that he could have been a Soc if life had gone differently, if his parents had stayed alive and he could have gone to college. So he really demonstrates that the line between greasers and Socs is pretty blurred because he could have been on the other side of it. There's also a big misunderstanding between Derry and Ponyboy. Derry is constantly worried about Ponyboy, which makes him a strict guardian, but Ponyboy misunderstands that, and he thinks that Derry doesn't love him. That's a big misunderstanding between characters. Okay, this seems like a lot of content for the greasers. Let me start brainstorming the other side. In the early scenes, we see Cherry taking Ponyboy seriously, listening to him, and really seeming to relate to his ideas and his appreciation of art. Eventually, she testifies in his favor after Johnny kills Bob. So she seems very willing to break the stereotypes of how a Soc will act. She tells us that the Socs have a lot of problems too. Early in the story, we don't see that, so there's not evidence to support it when she says it. But by the end of the story, we've seen a little more. We're told that Bob had struggled because his family was too permissive, let him get away with too much. And that might have been part of why he was consistently getting into trouble. Randy struggles because he feels as though he's disappointing his father when he's constantly getting into fights. So maybe the Socs did have troubles. They also had conflicts with their families that were not easily resolved. This is a lot of evidence, probably more than I'll be able to discuss, so let me start trying to organize it. To do that, I want to think about what each piece of evidence is providing. So for each piece of evidence, I'm going to sort of categorize it, give it an explanation. What is this helping me to prove? For Ponyboy, I think it's showing that he acts in a way that is not what I would expect from a greaser. Johnny as a character is, well, not what I expect out of a greaser. As I describe him as a character, he's not fitting the cliche image of a greaser. When Ponyboy and Johnny risk their lives to save the kids, that's an action that I would not expect greasers to take. When I describe Derry as being hardworking and caring so deeply for his brothers, that's not the way that I would expect greasers to act. All right, I'm clearly noticing a trend here. The explanation that I'm providing for all of my examples is the same. All of these characters are acting in ways that are not what I would expect from a greaser. I know that I'm having a little bit of an organization problem because I have too much evidence to provide one paragraph for each character. This looks like a good way to change my organization. I can group these together and do one paragraph all about the greasers. After all, these examples are all really demonstrating the same point. These characters are acting in ways that are unexpected for greasers. Okay, so this is suggesting a better organizational plan. I'll do one paragraph for the greasers, and then presumably one paragraph for the Socs, and that will mean that I can use much more of the evidence that I have. The next piece of evidence I have is about Derry and Ponyboy misunderstanding each other. This does give an example of a misunderstanding between people, but it's a different sort of misunderstanding. Neither character is acting in ways that are particularly unexpected from greasers, so this doesn't really seem to fit with the way that I'm seeing my evidence and my paragraphs develop. Okay, no problem. I'll just take out this example and not use it. So I have a lot of examples for the greasers. I've taken one out, but I still have 4 examples. Let me shift to think about the Socs. I have the idea that Cherry listens to Ponyboy. That's not the way that I expected a Soc to act. And I also have the struggles that the Socs have. Bob struggles with his family, showing that the Socs have family troubles too. And Randy struggles with his father. That's also showing that Socs have troubles. So maybe I have another paragraph about the Socs, showing that they also don't act in the way that I was expecting. They have more problems and more complexity than I would have initially thought. It seems like I'm in great shape for these paragraphs. I have one on the greasers and one on the Socs. Let me select my best pieces of evidence, 2 for each paragraph, and I'll use them in my improved version of my outline. I came up with a pretty straightforward topic sentence for my paragraph on the greasers. It says that greasers are more complex than they seem. And I think it was pretty easy to choose my top 2 pieces of evidence. I thought for sure that I needed to talk about Ponyboy, and since so much of the plot surrounds Johnny, I selected my character description of him as my second piece of evidence. For my paragraph on the Socs, I gave a pretty straightforward, similar topic sentence. Socs are more complex than they seem. Eventually, when I'm in the revising stage, I'd like to improve these. I'd like to make them a little different, maybe make them more specific to the greasers and the Socs. But for now, I'm basically reminding myself of my main ideas. And these are the main points that I want each paragraph to show. So it's good that I'm writing in a really straightforward way. Now let me pull in the evidence for my paragraph on the Socs. I selected the one about Cherry listening to Ponyboy and testifying in his favor. And then I thought that I would just combine Bob and Randy into one piece of evidence. We're not given a lot of detail about their struggles in the book, so I don't think I'll have a lot of content to provide in my analysis. So grouping them together seems very reasonable, and they're ultimately making the same point. Even though on the surface they seem to have these perfect lives, underneath there are family problems that they are both struggling with. Okay, fantastic. I have a good structure for a paragraph on the greasers, a good structure for a paragraph on the Socs, and now I have a problem. I only have 2 support paragraphs. It's a 5-paragraph essay. It needs 3 support paragraphs. I have an organizational problem. When I was focused on each character, I had too many support paragraphs. Now that I've grouped them by greasers and Socs, I have too few support paragraphs. This is a good reminder that it can be helpful as you brainstorm to go back to your tentative thesis. Do I still like the thesis? Am I actually proving what it says? Are there any parts of the thesis that I haven't discussed yet and I have to support if it's part of my thesis? So let's look again at our latest version, version 3 of our thesis. The Outsiders says prejudice leads to bad judgments and dangerous situations. Okay, The Outsiders says prejudice leads to bad judgments. Got it. Support paragraph about the greasers, support paragraph about the Socs. I definitely have evidence showing that. But I have no evidence showing how prejudice leads to dangerous situations. Fantastic. This gives me my 3rd support paragraph. Checking in with my thesis confirmed that I was on the right track because I have 2 support paragraphs that are clearly supporting a main point in my thesis. And it also helped me to brainstorm what my 3rd support paragraph should be about because I have an idea in my thesis that I haven't actually defended yet. As I've said before, I'm writing a pretty straightforward topic sentence for my brainstorm of my 3rd support paragraph. I know I need to say something about prejudice leading to dangerous situations, so I said misjudging others leads to terrible consequences. Basically the same idea. Prejudice is misjudging others, dangerous situations is terrible consequences. So I redid the wording a little bit, but it's basically the same content as my thesis. Again, when I'm going to do my revisions at the end, I might reword this. Maybe the way that I end up writing the paragraph will offer ideas about how to be more precise in my language. But for now, I'm not worried about it. I just want a clear picture of what the main idea of this paragraph is going to be, so that as I'm brainstorming and as I'm writing, I'm focused on that main idea. Let me start thinking about evidence to support this topic sentence. In some ways, it's not exactly the plot of the book. It's more the framework that the entire plot takes place in. But I thought that the constant fighting between the greasers and the Socs is a perfect example of how these assumptions and mistaken judgments about people are leading to so much violence. So I think that that could work as my first piece of evidence. I would have to just discuss the basic framework for the world that these kids live in. But I think that I can find specific evidence to support that. The second piece of key evidence that I am bringing in is the specific violence that occurs in the book. Before the book takes place, we're told that Johnny was severely beat up by the Socs, and this has really scarred Johnny. It has made him really skittish and prone maybe to more extreme violence. When he and Ponyboy are jumped, it's that framework, that background, that leads to Bob's death. Bob's death then indirectly leads to Johnny and Dally's deaths. So the framework of the constant fighting leads to Bob's death, which indirectly leads to 2 more deaths. All of this is coming from prejudice that led Johnny to get so severely beat up that he's reacting more quickly with fear and violence. Without such significant prejudice as a framework and the constant fighting that it leads to, then the 3 deaths we see in the book probably would not have occurred. So we can see pretty clearly that the misjudgments of others lead to terrible consequences. So let's review. It looks like I have 3 good support paragraphs. They all have a topic sentence. They all have 2 main pieces of evidence supporting the topic sentences. And all together, they're working to support my thesis. The first 2 are demonstrating how prejudice is actually a poor way to judge people, and the last support paragraph is how prejudice leads to bad consequences. I have a really good plan for the essay. Once your essay is organized at this point, you have topic sentences for each paragraph, and you have your evidence selected. It's time to go look for quotes. Those quotes are going to be the actual facts that prove that your thesis is right. It's really important that you select good quotes and use them well. I have another video where I talk about selecting and writing with quotes. I'll link to it in the description. For now, let's focus on our first support paragraph. We'll sort of zoom in on it, and I'll talk more about how to select quotes for it and how to write most of it. We have our first support paragraph outlined. Greasers are more complex than they seem is our topic sentence, and our first piece of evidence is that Ponyboy does well in school, likes poetry, and tries to stay out of trouble. When I was going back to look for a quote, I was pretty sure that I would find something where he describes himself as being maybe different from other greasers, and that he likes things that other people don't like. But I didn't have anything specific in mind. So I started at the beginning of the book where our main character is introduced, and I found what I think is a good quote. Ponyboy is talking about himself and says, "Nobody in our gang digs movies and books the way I do. For a while there, I thought I was the only person in the world that did." He's really emphasizing his uniqueness, the ways that he's different from other greasers. And this is exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Even though he looks like other greasers, he doesn't have the same preferences and the same valuing of art that they do. So he's not what you would expect out of a greaser. Okay, so this quote will work to support the idea that Ponyboy is unexpected. He's a more complex person than you might initially think for a greaser. For my second piece of evidence, I have the main point about Johnny, and I was pretty sure that I knew what quote I wanted for this. I remembered Ponyboy complimenting Johnny's analysis of Gone with the Wind. I thought this was a great moment because up until that point in the book, Ponyboy is our only greaser who does well in school, who has that sort of book smarts. And yet Ponyboy is impressed with Johnny's analysis of the book of Gone with the Wind. So if Ponyboy is complimenting Johnny, we can conclude that Johnny has good insights about the novel. I went back to look and I was happy that the quote says exactly what I was hoping it would. Ponyboy is speaking and he says, "It amazed me how Johnny could get more meaning out of some of the stuff in there than I could. I was supposed to be the deep one." This is really emphasizing Johnny's intelligence and his insight, along with his general appreciation for art, none of which is what we expect out of a greaser. So I have quotes for both of my examples, and I'm ready to start using the quotes and building my paragraph. When you go to write your paragraph, if you've done a good job with your outline and followed my advice, you'll already have a lot of the paragraph written. That's why we're spending so much time getting the outline good. I remember when I was in high school and my teachers told me to write outlines, and I used to roll my eyes and think what a waste of time it was and not understand why they were suggesting it. Maybe they didn't do a good job explaining why it was so important, or maybe I was just being stubborn. But hopefully I can persuade you that doing an outline is really important, partly because it helps you to take small steps. At any stage, all we're working on is maybe one support paragraph or one example in one support paragraph. It's a pretty narrow focus that we're building. And we don't need to write well, and we don't need to write in complete sentences. We just need to get our basic ideas on the paper. But now that we've done that work, we've built a really nice outline, one that we'll be able to use to build our essay. Okay, so let's focus on our first support paragraph. I've taken the outline, but I've pulled, as you can see, the first sentence, our topic sentence, and I've put it in bold. I did that because it's exactly the same as the topic sentence that I had written before. I haven't changed anything. I haven't had to write anything new. I already had a topic sentence for this paragraph. I'm just putting it in paragraph form now. So my outline is already coming in handy. I don't need to think of a new topic sentence. I have one already. However, I realized that saying greasers are more complex than they seem kind of requires that I say how greasers seem. The whole point of this paragraph is that greasers don't act in the way that we expect, so I need to make it clear how we would expect greasers to act. So I went back into the story, and fortunately Ponyboy talks about this early on, so I was able to use some of his own language and include that as part of the introduction to this paragraph. So I added a sentence that says Ponyboy describes them as being wild in hoods, though he insists that not all greasers are like that. And the last part of that sentence transitions nicely into my main idea, that the greasers are more complex, and I'm about to show you how. This second sort of introductory sentence won't always be required, but the fact that I haven't yet explained how we expect greasers to act means I don't think I'm in a good position to prove to you that greasers are unexpected, because you just don't know what the expectations are yet. I might go back and combine these two sentences into one topic sentence for the paragraph, but I can work on that later when I'm revising it. For now, I pulled my main topic sentence from my outline, and I only had to write one additional sentence to make the point clear. Now I'm ready to dive into my first example, which is about Ponyboy. So I'm going to pull the exact sentence that I have already written and just put that into my paragraph. No new work, I'm just copy-pasting. Now I'm ready to pull the quote that I selected. Okay, this needs a little bit of work because quotes need some kind of a framing. You have to give a basic point of where in the story this occurs, who's talking, what was the person thinking about. So I offer a very small introduction to the quote. Explaining why he is walking alone, Ponyboy reflects, and then I give the quote. Not too much extra writing, I just needed to frame the quote a little bit. Now I have a little work to do because every example that you give needs analysis. You have to do the work to show the reader how this evidence is working as evidence. How does this prove your thesis? Okay, so I need to show how this quote about Ponyboy shows that greasers are more complex than they seem. Prejudice is bad because Ponyboy is not what we expect out of a greaser. I added a sentence that focuses on Ponyboy's values and the ways that those might be unexpected. Ponyboy values the artistic experience of movies and books so deeply that he will risk the dangerous situation of walking alone so as to not have the artistic experience ruined. That explains why I've included in the quote the idea that he loaned it, and it emphasizes the isolation that he feels. He thinks that he's particularly unique for valuing artistic experiences. He values them so much that he's willing to risk getting jumped, which he does, by going to the movies alone. Ponyboy doesn't see himself like a classic greaser, and we should not see him like that either. So I'm done with my evidence about Ponyboy. The paragraph is developing nicely. You can see the sentences in bold are ones that I already had in my outline, so about half of the paragraph was already written. So I'll take the sentence where I show that Johnny is the next piece of evidence I'm providing. I'll lead into the quote, I'll give the quote, I'll analyze the quote, and I'll be done. And now I just need to mimic that pattern for all the rest of my paragraphs. Hopefully this one example shows you how to do it for the rest of the essay. Okay, now that my support paragraphs are nicely developed, I'd like to work on improving the writing, specifically the writing of my thesis, because it's such an important part of my essay. The writing overall of the essay will hopefully have some revisions at the end of this process. At this point, I'm still kind of in the middle of the process, but this is a revision that's so important because the thesis needs to be great. The thesis needs to be as clear and as vivid as I can make it, to make it very obvious to my reader what the goal of this paper was all about, and hopefully it will then become clear how my evidence really proved my thesis true. Let's go back to where we were, version 3 of my thesis. The outsider says prejudice leads to bad judgments in dangerous situations. This is basically what the support paragraphs have proven, so I don't have any major revisions to do, but I would still like to strive for more precision and more vividness in the writing. With the goal of being more precise in writing, I suggest that you never keep the adjectives good or bad in final versions, especially in your thesis statement. The problem with them is just that they're so vague. It can be good or bad in a variety of ways. You're just not communicating enough information. If you ask yourself bad in what way, it will hopefully lead you to a much more precise adjective. That's what I did here. I asked myself, in what way are the judgments bad? And I thought that they're bad judgments because they're inaccurate. So I just swapped inaccurate for the word bad. Now I have version 4, which says that the outsider says prejudice leads to inaccurate judgments and dangerous situations. I've gained some precision just by taking out the adjective bad and thinking about in what way the judgments are bad. The thesis as I have it is fine, but the relationship of the ideas is still not clear, and I think that I can do better. The way I have it now, it basically just says that prejudice leads to these two things, and it doesn't differentiate between them. Prejudice just leads to them equally or at the same time. It isn't really clear. If I think more about it, there's a certain connection that I'd like to emphasize here. The prejudice is the first step. When you let prejudice operate in your mind, then you get inaccurate judgments. When you let those inaccurate judgments guide your actions, then you get dangerous situations. So it's not as though prejudice leads to inaccurate judgments and dangerous situations equally or at the same time. In fact, it's as though the prejudice leads first to the inaccurate judgments and then to the dangerous situations. I want to try to emphasize that in my thesis. So I reworked it for version 5, and now it says, the outsiders dramatizes the violence, that's the dangerous situations, the violence that can follow inaccurate judgments. Okay, this is clearer because now I'm saying the violence is the last step and it's following the inaccurate judgments. What kind of inaccurate judgments? Those that are based on prejudice. This emphasizes that prejudice starts the chain. Prejudice leads to inaccurate judgments, and that leads to violence or dangerous situations. So I've been a little more specific about how the ideas relate, and I think that strengthens my thesis. As you can see, I also swapped out verbs. Instead of just saying the outsiders says, I offered a more vivid verb with dramatizes. It's just a little more sophisticated and I hope clearer about what the book is doing. I think the language is vivid, it's clear, and when I think back on my supporting paragraphs, they do a good job of really defending that this thesis is true for the book. I've emphasized quite heavily thinking about your thesis, working on your support paragraphs, building your evidence bit by bit, and I've given you no advice about the introduction or the conclusion, except to say that you shouldn't worry about it. And I think that that's true, but let me offer one tip. It can be a good hook and be clear and exciting writing to use quotes in your introduction and or your conclusion. Hopefully, as you're pouring through the book, looking for quotes to use throughout the support paragraphs, you'll stumble upon some quotes that are kind of good and basically on your topic, but don't exactly work in any of your supports. That happened to me twice, so I thought I'd give you 2 examples of quotes that would work great either in my introduction or conclusion. As I was looking for quotes that I could use as evidence, I came upon this one. We look hoodie and they look decent. It could be just the other way around. Half the hoods I know are pretty decent guys underneath all that grease. And from what I've heard, a lot of socias are just cold-blooded mean. But people usually go by looks. I think this would work in my introduction because it introduces the overall topic really clearly. It's about prejudice and the claim that it leads to inaccurate judgments. Greasers are not the way you might expect, and neither are socias. It didn't fit any of the specific evidence that I was building in my outline, but it was on topic, and I thought it would work well in my introduction. As a quote that could work in my conclusion, I found this one where Ponyboy is thinking about the value of the writing that he has produced. I could picture hundreds and hundreds of boys living on the wrong sides of cities, boys with black eyes who jumped at their own shadows, hundreds of boys who maybe watched sunsets and looked at stars and ached for something better. Someone should tell their side of the story, and maybe people would understand then and wouldn't be so quick to judge a boy by the amount of hair oil he wore. As a general point, this is about prejudice and the fact that it leads to mistaken judgments, but it's also sort of a call to action. Ponyboy is telling their story, hopefully to persuade people to move past prejudices and not form those mistaken judgments. And the spirit of that I thought would work nicely in the conclusion. So as general advice for your introduction and conclusion, keep an eye out for quotes that are on your topic but don't exactly fit any of the specific pieces of evidence that you have in your support paragraphs. My last piece of closing advice is about proofreading. Often at that point in the essay writing process, you're exhausted. Maybe you're running a little behind schedule, so you're rushing, and you don't always have the patience to do a great job proofreading. Also, it's just not that much fun. I understand that, but you want to at least give it 1 or 2 really careful proofreads. The way to maximize your efficiency on those proofreads is by knowing your own writing and what your own mistakes tend to be. When you go to proofread, then only focus on those mistakes. For example, I know that I struggle with verb tenses when I'm writing. For reasons that I don't understand, I'm constantly switching between past and present tense with absolutely no system to it. But I know this about my writing. So when I'm done having written anything, I give it 1 read through where I only look at verb tenses. I don't try to catch any other mistakes except those that I know are my biggest problem. And that way I fix my biggest problem without needing to do many, many read-throughs. So figure out what your biggest 1 or 2 mistakes tend to be, and then proofread just looking to fix those mistakes each time. My other suggestion about proofreading is to take the time to read the essay aloud. When we read to ourselves, we often automatically correct mistakes. Reading aloud forces you to slow down and read what's actually on the paper. That can often help you catch a lot of your own mistakes, especially ones that are just basic typing mistakes. I hope this was full of helpful suggestions on how to write a 5-paragraph essay so that you'll have a lot more confidence the next time you're writing one. If you think that you'll use any of these strategies, please like the video. And if you have any follow-up questions, please put them in the comments. When we read to ourselves, we often automatically correct mistakes. When we read to ourselves, we often automatically correct. My goodness.